Another in our ongoing series of Winter Warmer Talks, which are aimed at bringing you a little light and community during these winter months and to highlight and showcase various features of the wonderful Royal Parks. I'm Laura. I was the Community Learning Officer at the Royal Parks until very recently, and now I'm a very willing volunteer hosting the online talks that we've got going through the winter warmer season. And the Royal Parks is the charity that looks after the 8 Royal Parks in London, which are Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, the Green Park, St James's Park, Regent's Park and Primrose Hill, Bushy Park, Greenwich Park and Richmond Park. And through their work, they aim to engage as many people as possible with the rich heritage that the parks have to offer, keep them free and accessible so that everyone can enjoy the wellbeing benefits that they provide, and also to protect and improve the parks for the wonderful biodiversity, which is the wildlife that they have in the parks. And just a reminder that this talk is being recorded so that it can be uploaded and accessed to our YouTube channel for you to enjoy again at a later date. So if your names and faces appear in this recording, don't worry, we'll block you out at a later date. Please feel free to use the chat to say hello, like I've said. Let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to hear from you and any questions you might have for our speakers. And you're also welcome to react and use the applause panels, etc. If you've got those active as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's guest speakers. We have Sasha and Sheldon here today. Thank you for joining us. They are queer historians and cemetery tour guides who are going to take us on a virtual journey across Brompton Cemetery to discover all new stories of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and non-heteronormative people buried there. And these are timeless tales of our queerly departed, often forgotten and frequently overlooked. So they're incredible stories that can still resonate with our lives today. And I'm so excited to therefore pass over to you two. So Sasha and Sheldon, take it away, go for it.
Hello, thank you for the lovely introduction there as well. It's lovely to be here for you're in the UK, it's LGBT History Month. If you're in the USA, we know it's Black History Month. We kind of swap these around across the Atlantic. I've just started sharing my screen, so we're going to jump into the presentation now. So welcome to Queerly Departed. Now, first of all, let's do a little introduction to who we are. So hello, my name is Sasha Coward. My pronouns are he, him. I've been working in museums now for over a decade. I'm now freelance and my passion is queer history. And we'll talk a little bit about that word queer in a moment, but basically I focus on all kinds of history, but particularly the stories of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, asexual, all of those identities, the kind of people that fall through the cracks. Those are my passions. And since becoming good friends with Sheldon, I've been able to do tours in cemeteries, which is kind of Sheldon's passion that he'll tell you a bit about. Sheldon, who are you?
Hello, everyone. I am Sheldon K. Goodman. My pronouns are he, him, and as Sasha very kindly introduced, I am a death and queer historian, and I've been running for the past 8 years a blog called Cemetery Club, which highlights cemeteries as museums of people. And I've been doing tours in cemeteries for about 5 or 6 years now. And as a gay man myself, I pride myself on highlighting histories that essentially aren't white Victorian men, because I do think that white Victorian men they've had enough time in the spotlight. So women's history, queer history, black history, and so on are my forte. And that's, again, becoming friends with Sasha. We were approached by the Royal Parks about 2 or 3 years ago to develop the country's first LGBTQ cemetery tour, based in Brompton Cemetery, one of the historic London cemeteries, also known as the Magnificent Seven. Next slide, please, Mr. Chris Whitty.
So one of the things I just want to start with is, as Sheldon said, Queerly Departed was the very first time that we did tours like this, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the rest of our work. But we are going to be using the word queer a lot. Now, we both understand as historians that queer is a divisive term. I grew up in the UK in the 90s and early 2000s, so I grew up under Section 28, and I know that Sheldon did as well, meaning that during this time, educating about lesbian, gay, bisexual, non-heterosexual, non-cisgender identities was actually illegal, so teachers weren't actually allowed to talk about it. And that meant that homophobia and transphobia was rife. So a word like queer, when I grew up, was an insult as well as an identity. So I can fully understand why for many people who were bullied by this word, who were attacked by the word queer, that this is not a word that they identify with. And we would never force or ask anyone to use that word if they weren't comfortable with it. Now, the thing about the word queer is since pretty much the 70s, it has had this other term, this reclaimed meaning, where it's been taken back as an insult, originally a pejorative, taken by some people in the LGBT plus community to basically talk about as an umbrella term, to talk about anyone that is non-heteronormative or non-heterosexual. So if you do not like the term queer and you hear us use it in this talk, you can replace it with LGBT plus. And there's a whole conversation to be had around that, but that's how we use it. So do you want to give a bit more context about what the pictures we're looking at the moment, Sheldon?
Yes, so obviously in a time before plague and pandemic, this was a live event and we invited X amount of people to come to the cemetery proper to actually go and explore the graves of the people whose lives that we have found to be connected to the LGBTQ community. And on the left-hand side of your screens, we have the fabulous Virgin Extravaganza, who is a very well-respected and well-known London-based drag performer. And then on the right, we also have Son of a Tutu, who is another fantastic drag performer who helped us in the chapel, in the beautiful chapel of Brompton Cemetery, kickstart the tour by giving a live action performance of songs that are related or linked to queer experience and history. So we're very grateful that Virgin particularly has allowed us to continue using our image as part of promoting these tours. And again, that's one of the things that we're quite passionate about with this particular project, which is getting people who are members of the community today to help speak up for the voices of whose we kind of talk about so actively and randomly in the past as well. So again, it's more than a tour. It's more than a tour. And as a result of this particular project and this particular tour, it's had a number of spin-offs. It's a bit like Gremlins, but for so we were also asked by Arnes Vale Cemetery in Bristol to do Drop Dead Gorgeous, where we were looking at their queer dead, and also about just over a week ago, the Jewellery Quarter cemeteries in Birmingham asked us to produce Diamonds in the Rough, and that photo there is again limited numbers because of plague of us in Key Hill Cemetery in Birmingham, introducing the Birmingham locals to their LGBTQ plus dead. I think they were standing at the grave of Harriet Martineau, who is a wonderful, possibly lesbian, possibly bisexual woman who you should look up. But anyway, that's another tour for another time. Next slide, please. So this is going to be our route for today. So again, if you want to take a screenshot, if you want to have a look in your own time, please feel free to take a little screenshot of this. And if you want to kind of go and lay flowers at their grave today, or if you've got a lunch hour, if you've got a spare afternoon, you want to go hunting, this is where you're going to be finding our queer people of note. Now, we're not going to be doing the tour in the order that you see on the screen. This is just a handy guide. Reasons for that, we just feel like it. But these are the locations of the people. They are fairly spread out. There are different parts and regions of the cemetery, and I'm sure if you're familiar with Brompton Cemetery, you'll know that there are bits which are grander than others, and that indeed does reflect where many of the queer dead we're talking about are residing in their eternal resting place. We've got some kind of adrift in what was once common graves, so graves that were shared with other people because they were too poor to afford their own plots. And then you've got big old fancy tombs and granite slabs where the people are hobnobbing with the hoi and the polloi of London society of the 19th century. So from the North Gate, which is the primary entrance of the cemetery, quite close to West Brompton Station on the left-hand side there, walk down the Central Avenue, and then you go to the South Lodge, and then over the way there is a petrol station, and then a long road to Fulham Broadway. So it's probably best if you do visit the cemetery in person, to start on the left-hand side of the screen and then just kind of meander your way through the various headstones and what have you. Next slide, please, Sasha. So when we're talking about queer history, again, Sasha's already kind of spoken about this, but we should also give a shout out as to why this project got off the ground in the first place. It was primarily the idea of a volunteer by the name of Floria London, who suggested the idea to the then public engagement manager, Dan Gilbert, to look into this queer history. And this is where me and Sasha were brought on as queer historians and researchers to basically put meat on the bones and to help find these particular histories, because queer history is not an easy history to find. It is not openly suggested. It is not openly said. A lot of the lives of which we're talking about were of people who were living at a time when it was not safe to openly be homosexual or gay or lesbian, or again, terms to describe historical instances. These are not necessarily terms that they would have used themselves in their own lifetimes. And knowing this, and knowing that there is a difficulty where it's very rare you come across someone saying, I love this man, or I love this woman, you do have to kind of read between the lines. And there is I don't want to say gut instinct, but there is an almost gut instinct when you look at these histories, and you see it, the suggestion, you see it how these kind of stories have been relayed and how they've been written down, and how and again you can go into things like census records as well, seeing who was living with who, and you kind of get a sense for it. And as a result of that, it's also interesting to note as well, we're not doing this to out anyone. We're not painting a narrative over someone's history. In many respects, we're doing this respectfully. We are trying to give a voice to them because many of them did not or have the opportunity to live their own truths in their own lifetimes. And so we are reclaiming that history and speaking up for them as ambassadors in the 21st century. Because as both me and Sasha are fully aware, we are part of a chain. We are part of LGBTQ history that has been going on for donkey's years. And the history will continue long after we ourselves are gone as well. So we want to keep these stories alive. And by doing that, we're doing it respectfully and also basically acting up on their behalf, if anything. So that's the kind of the way that we're approaching the histories of which we're speaking about today.
It's a shame that with these stories, there is often a sense of controversy, which I think is often manufactured.
Yes.
You know, we do these tours and the people that come love them, the historians that come love them. But of course, in the Facebook comment sections, we sometimes get some backlash, people claiming that we are digging up the dead, that we are being insensitive. And there's a few important responses. Firstly, both of us as historians, we're still legitimate historians and we're still doing legitimate history. Just because it's about LGBT history, that doesn't change that. And we want to get to the point where, in a sense, there is no queer history simply because it becomes just part of history. The fact is, if we don't focus on it, if we don't do LGBT History Month, it does not get spoken about. Also, as a final point, as two LGBT people ourselves, myself and Sheldon, if anyone is going to handle stories like being closeted and not wanting people to know about your identity with sensitivity, I would argue people who have had that lived experience themselves are possibly the most able to navigate that tricky, thorny path. So without further ado, let's get on to your first story, Sheldon.
Indeed. Next slide. So these are the Keeleys, Robert and Mary Ann Keeley, who are buried just behind the main central kind of open-air cathedral part of the cemetery. Now, the Keeleys were an acting couple who had a very long tenure on the stage in the 19th century. And they were exceptionally well known because they challenged identity and gender on the stage for basically for mass consumption and public entertainment. But they did it in a way that was incredibly, basically it made people confront the fact that gender and identity were a flexible thing. And again, in terms of visibility on stage, these two were probably the leading luminaries of actually kind of giving it some steam under that particular pretense. Now, for example, so Robert on the left-hand side here was known for playing almost like pantomime Dane type characters. And his wife, Mary, was known in her younger days to play what was known as principal boys. So when she was younger, she would play the role of the boy on stage. And there's various reasons as to why they deliberately chose roles that subverted gender in that manner. Now, it's also important to note that these two were not queer. They were man and wife. They were married. As far as we know, they did not express same-sex affiliations or kind of relationships with anyone else that we know of. But it's important to know that in terms of visibility, and indeed their support for this kind of art form, it was basically feeding into a wider growing acceptance that was slowly, very painfully slowly growing momentum in the 19th century. So next slide, Sasha, if we could, I think it's the right slide. Here we go. So I'll talk about Robert Keeley first. Now, Robert was born in 1793, and he was one of 16 children. And when he was old enough, he was apprenticed to Hansard, which was the official printer to the Palace of Westminster, which is a place we're hearing no end of at the moment. His father was a watchmaker, and with a large family to support, he had to basically go into work earn a trade. And also, again, he had siblings to support and so on. And as a result of that, he wanted to keep the workhouse at bay. So he was, he started working at this printer's, and then fairly shortly afterwards became a bit dissatisfied with it. It wasn't his passion. He wasn't particularly interested in it. And so he ran away and joined a travelling acting company. And his first big break was in the Richmond Theatre in 1813, before moving up to Norwich, where he served for 4 years, and then he had a residency at the West London Theatre. Now, his first professional appearance on stage was at the Olympic Theatre, which is long gone, as many places that many of the people buried in Brompton Cemetery knew are now obviously been demolished. And he appeared as Leporello in Don Giovanni in London, which was based on Mozart's opera. And he had other roles. He performed at the Royal Opera House, he performed at the Adelphi and Sadler's Wells. And for a brief time in the 1840s, he also managed the Lyceum Theatre. And it was at this point that round about this time, he actually got his penchant for gender swapping roles. And he was actually nurtured and encouraged to take on these kind of roles by none other than Charles Dickens. Now, Charles Dickens is known as the tour guide's friend in the business because he frankly pops up bloody everywhere. He is all over the place in the 1870s, but he obviously died in the 1870s. But I'm sure many of you who are London like aficionados and fans, he knew everyone. He went everywhere. He walked everywhere. There's almost like there's no street in London where he didn't kind of go down. And the Keeleys actually had a very good relationship with Dickens, to the point where Robert Keeley actually approached Charles Dickens and said, "Would you mind if we did an adaptation of Martin Chuzzlewit?" To which Dickens went, "Oh my God, yes, of course, please knock yourself out, please do." And so as he did so, Dickens said, "Well, if you do that, there's one role I would like you to play, Mr. Keeley, and that is of Sarah Gamp." And of course, first off, Robert was a little bit like, it's a woman's role. I'm not really sure that's all. He said, no, please, look, you've got the acting chops for it. You can do it brilliantly. And so he kind of, he approached the role as he did with any other. And this is where the unusual thing is for this particular time in history. At this point, gender swapping roles in the 19th century played into two particular like facets. So either had the really camp pantomime dame roles, which still pervade in pantomimes today, and then you had like the bitter old kind of sarcastic, almost like drag queen performance roles. So again, it was almost like subverting what men saw women to be and how women were interpreted as men and so on. He thought, blow that, I've got no interest in doing it like that. And he approached the role with as much respect as he would as if he was playing Hamlet or any other particular role. And he became the toast of the town in this particular role. And he, as I said, this was the first role he did of this particular manner. And it's also, in modern day terms, he was one of the first dames of theatre, essentially. And on the right hand side here, we have the character of Mrs. Caudle, which is a character by a friend of Dickens called Douglas Gerald. Now, this was a very popular character in the 19th century. It was basically a busybody woman who henpecked her husband with continual kind of aspirations of trying to be better, trying to improve her social standing, always making comments about various things and bits and bobs and pieces and so on. And there's another character who basically in the 1980s and 1990s inherited this mantle. Sasha, if we could have the next slide, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the angle I'm going for here. Hyacinth Bouquet, it's basically the same character, but in the 19th century, domineering, overburdened. Now, in this particular role, he was deliberately hamming it up a bit because that's what the character called for. But he was doing it with such conviction. This character was beloved by Victorian audiences. And the fact that it was played by a man, and so well and convincingly by a man, he wasn't doing it as a figure of fun. He was doing it, if anything, to actually to kind of highlight the fact that he was actually a member of society who we shouldn't lampoon and laugh at. They are just as valid to society as everyone else is. Now, there's also an interesting link, and I'll go into this later on the further people that I talk about, in that there is a unique link to Frankenstein, particularly with Robert Keeley, because one of the first roles, one of the roles he did when he was starting out as an actor in 1823, was the first performance of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's novel, on the London stage. Now, if you go to the next slide, Sasha, I think that should cover it. So on the next, so this is the, on the left-hand side here, you have the poster for the final night of Frankenstein, or it was known as Presumption, or the Fate of Frankenstein in 1823, and it was public. It was, you know, it was a big old production, which had the addition of music. Obviously, that wasn't a feature in the original novel by Mary Shelley, and various other actors and so on as well. And it was, again, it was one of the leading productions of the early 19th century. And he actually originated a particularly famous role that wasn't actually in the original book by Mary Shelley, because Robert Keeley himself was actually the first actor to portray the role of Fritz, who was Dr. Frankenstein's assistant. This is not a character that was in the book. It was written especially for Mr. Keeley, by Richard Brinsley Peake, who was the one who was responsible for actually bringing this, the adaptation to the stage. And you know, Fritz goes by other names. He's also known as Igor, and he's also known as Karl, I think, in The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. So it's funny how this role with which he actually originated, it was written especially for him. And it's also this particular production of Frankenstein where Richard Brinsley Peake actually created the line, "It lives!" Again, that's not in the actual original source material. That was written for the stage play, and it's now been inherited by further and subsequent adaptations that have happened since. So one of the good things as well, going on for this link to Keeley and Frankenstein, and indeed it's linked to the queer community as well. And there's academic papers that have been published on this, the influence of Frankenstein on the queer community. And that's a whole other talk in itself. I'll leave you to your independent Googling to kind of bring that to the fore. Next slide, please, Sasha. Is that the queer link to Frankenstein, and it's interesting to see when this first iteration with which Keeley was a part of, is that the monster himself did not have a name. He was not known as Frankenstein's monster. He was just nothing. And in all promotional material, the character itself is actually referred to as a line of dashes. So it's dash 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 dash, you know, played by such and such actor. And Mary Shelley herself loved this. She thought it was an absolutely fantastic way of describing the character. She said, "How do you name the unnamable?" And this is something you could use particularly when you see how Frankenstein as a character has been taken to the bosom of the queer community. Because essentially Frankenstein, on the nuts and bolts, he says, as sticking out the neck, came up with that myself. As the kind of nuts and bolts of this story is that it's essentially a father-son story, a dysfunctional father-son story where the monster is a daddy too, in a way. And when you're gay and you're growing up and you're feeling like a little bit of a hideous misfit, you're fully conscious that some believe your desires to be wicked, and you want to kill you for them and so on. Identifying with the character of the monster isn't actually too much of a stretch, particularly when you see how the monster is persecuted in the novels and stuff. And again, you can see there are incredible parallels with the queer community, particularly if, in my own experience, coming out and so on. And again, I'm sure Sasha has similar instances too. You can see exactly why this character is kind of like, oh, okay, he's kind of like almost like a hero thing going on as well. And it's been repurposed, it's been reinvented, and you can see how Rocky Horror, for example, that's much the same thing. Obviously, Dr. Frankenfurter, Make Me a Man, it's essentially Frankenstein and so on. And also you've got the likes of Lady Bunny, who here is seen in the roasting episode of RuPaul's Drag Race a couple of years ago, where she was asked about by a trans woman and writer and theorist, Susan Stryker, about how does Frankenstein relate to her as a performer. And she goes, "I completely identify with the character of Frankenstein's monster. I wake up, put on makeup, and scare people." So that's Lady Bunny's kind of interpretation of Frankenstein as a kind of a queer icon, if anything. Now, it's also interesting to note, next slide, please, Sasha. And I literally found this out this afternoon. is that there is another queer link, particularly with the dead of Brompton Cemetery, to this story. And on the left-hand side here is another actor who was a contemporary of Keeley's, and he was a guy called T.P. Cook, Thomas Potter Cook. And he was a famous actor and theatre manager in his own right. And he was the first actor ever to play the monster. He was the one who played dash, 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 dash. And he's buried very, very close by to the Keeleys. I dare say that was probably deliberate. They were probably very good friends from what I can work out. And he was probably best known for, other than being the first Frankenstein's monster, he was known for his appearance in a play called Black-Eyed Susan. But on the right-hand side here, you see an etching of his first appearance in 1823. And it's a very different version of Frankenstein's monster that we're probably more contemporarily aware with. You know, you're familiar with like the big old forehead, the nuts and bolts, the big shoulders, the huge boots. In the 1820s, Frankenstein's monster looks very, very different. There's almost like a Romanesque quality to him there. You know, you've got the toga, the long flowing hair. You know, it's a very, very different kind of creation. And it just shows you how public consciousness has molded and shaped this character in the intervening years after the original publication of the book. So moving on from Mr. Keeley, we move on to his wife. And this is just a general location to give you a sense of where they are in the cemetery. So you've got the open-air cathedral bit there, and they're just behind there with that red point there. Now, this is his wife, Mary. Now, on the left-hand side, this is the last ever photo taken of her. She was a very, very old actor when she died. She was born in 1806 and she died in 1899. And at the time of her death, she was regarded as the grand old dame of the British stage. You wouldn't, I dare say most of you probably haven't heard of her, which is a shame because she had the same kind of acting chops as Helen Mirren, frankly. She was that, you know, that highly regarded. And again, you're going back to my early point, she was also someone who kind of played around with gender and identity, particularly in her younger years. She was born Mary Ann Goward, and she was originally born in Ipswich. And as a young girl, again, she wasn't a typical girl. She was quite tomboyish, actually. She would often help out at the local theatre with things like set design, with things like painting sets and moving props and so on. And it was at this time that she actually got the acting bug. She had a very fine singing voice, and she was naturally destined for the stage. And so at the age of 20, she sang as Rosina in an English comic opera. And she also played a mermaid in Weber's Oberon, which was a non-speaking role originally, but her voice is highly regarded that she actually sang the finale for a specially written song in Act 3. Now, she married Robert in 1829. And around about this time, she was also known for playing boys' roles in theatres. Notably, she was best known for playing the 18th century criminal Jack Sheppard. And around about this time in the 1820s, she was playing this role. It was an interesting time in theatre because this was a very masculine role. Now, for those of you who don't know who Jack Sheppard was, again, he was an 18th century highwayman, and he became something of a criminal folk hero. Now, this is obviously not really on for the authorities of the time. And as a result of her portrayal of him as a slightly effete feminine man, really, this kind of helped build the iconography of the character. And again, people took this character to their bosoms to the point where Sheppardism in the 1820s and 1830s really did begin to pervade, and authorities were really quite concerned that actually we are romanticizing a criminal, particularly by kind of like playing around with gender and identity in particular regard. And so as a result of this, the play was banned by 1840, and she had to move on to play another role. And here is an etching of Smike in Nicholas Nickleby, who is, which is, again, time of the 1830s, one of Charles Dickens's greatest books and plays. If she played this role, people would have been very well known. Well, they would have, well, the book which she was kind of characterizing and so on. And so these breeches role was something that she was known for in her early career. Now, obviously, she aged, she got older, the roles didn't work out that way. So next slide, please, Sasha. Another one. So this is another role here. So this is Jack Sheppard, but this isn't actually being played by Mary Keeley. This is actually being played by her successor, who's literally buried right next door to her, essentially. It's funny how the actors kind of chose to get buried to one another. And this is an actress by the name of Nellie Farron. Now, you've got Mary Ann Keeley on the left-hand side, and you've got Nellie playing Jack Sheppard in the 1870s when the ban was lifted. Obviously, historical distance had allowed the Sheppardism, the Sheppardite kind of cult to dissipate somewhat. And so Nellie Farron herself, next slide, please, Sasha, was someone else who, again, liked to play with gender and identity. And this is her grave just around the back of that central part in Brompton Cemetery there. And she came from Lancashire, and she came from an acting family. She married actor Robert Soutar, which is why her name became Ellen Soutar in later life. And her son was also an actor as well. But she was also known for playing for breeches roles herself. Next slide, please, Sasha. And around about this time as well, acting off the experiences of the Keeleys, and again, you know, men playing women and women playing men, really playing around with how audiences perceived gender roles on the stage. On the right-hand side, you can see her in one of the roles, and you know, she's playing like a young teenage boy on the stage. And even on the left-hand side, this is her in much later life, actually 2 years before she actually ended up passing away. She has that boyish look to her. This is something that she carried on right up until her early 50s, when she sadly passed away from heart disease. But also regarding Nellie's performance on stage, she was known to really, well, not sexualize the role per se, but certainly how she portrayed boys and stuff on stage, how she used to dress herself. It played into the fact that when she was on stage, she would often be in tights, because that's the nature of the role, and that's particularly how kind of audiences kind of, you know, took on or accepted these kind of these gender swapping roles. And when she was actually on stage, many of her supporters used to wear her colours. She used to have like colours of red, blue, and white, and so on, you know, which she would use to broadcast to her fans. And they would kind of hold up scarves in the audience to show their support to her. She, you know, a formidably popular and well-respected actor in her own right. And again, as she grew older, she kind of grew out of those roles. But again, yeah, you know, I guess you know, all three of them together buried, or four even if you include T.P. Cook as well, who are hugely important into the portrayal of gender and identity on the 19th century Victorian stage. Sasha.
So I'm now moving on to tell you a bit about, and I know I shouldn't have favourites, but this is probably my favourite person that I get to talk about on this tour. All the other stories are great too, but there's something special about Luisa. So this is Luisa Cassatti, who was born in Milan in 1881. When you hear a bit more about her, there's no surprise she was born in Milan. So Luisa's name, she's got two different other names. One of them is Luisa Marchesa Cassatti Stampa di Sonchino. The other one is Luisa Adela Rosa Maria Aman. This was a woman with a lot of clout, right? This was a woman also with a lot of privilege. Now, the thing you need to know about Luisa Cassatti is basically, she's kind of Lady Gaga, eat your heart out. She was in so many sense a socialite, a fashion icon, a symbol. And when she was, you know, living back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so the turn of the 20th century, the things that she would do, the way that she would present herself was so modern that some of the photographs of Luisa look like something that was taken yesterday from the front cover of Vogue. So she was a party goer. She was known to throw incredible parties where she would descend down a spiral staircase, possibly leading two cheetahs on diamond leashes, or with an anaconda, a live snake draped around her neck. Now, I'm sure Petter would have a lot to say about her, but she was known as a muse for many different artists. Now, she actually did marry a man called Camillo, who was a Marquess, which is how she became the Marchesa and how she ended up having so much money and clout at the tender age of 19. Now, these two basically lived separate lives. As soon as they got married, they lived in 2 separate houses, and they separated in 1914, but basically stayed married until until Camillo died, and Luisa continued to use his name. Now, they did actually have one daughter, Christina, but basically Luisa overshadowed her child in nearly every sense. So we will have a moment to talk a little bit about Christina, because she is fascinating. Now, one of the things, so the queer links with Luisa, is she wanted to be a walking work of art. She classically said she didn't want to be beautiful, she wanted to be art. She wanted to shock. One of the parties that she threw, she basically created all these identical stone replicas of herself and waxworks, and she stood pretending to be a waxwork. And then when people would walk by and gossip about her, she would suddenly move to scare them. So she loved to shock, and she also was clearly very fluid in her sexuality. Now, she's mentioned in this fascinating book by a man called Compton Mackenzie called Extraordinary Women, right? Now, Extraordinary Women talks about a group of women who lived in the Isle of Capri, now, as well as Lesbos, so the island in Greece, which is associated with lesbianism through the poet Sappho. Capri was known to be a queer escape for many gay, bisexual, and trans men and women from the UK would go there. Now, the Extraordinary Women were actually a group of lesbian women who were all together in a commune, and many of them were artists and poets. The likes of the middle picture there is Romaine Brooks. Now, Romaine Brooks is a famous artist who created many beautiful paintings, particularly of other women, and also had many girlfriends and wrote extensively about her relationships with other women. Now, included in the story of Extraordinary Women is Luisa, who would like to go on holiday to Capri. Now, you see this painting on the far right. Well, this was painted by Romaine. So Romaine met Luisa, was infatuated with Luisa, who she thought was incredible, mysterious, beautiful, and androgynous, and thought she was gorgeous. Now, at the same time, this is a picture of Romaine with her girlfriend, Natalie Barney. Now, apparently, Natalie had come to go with Romaine on holiday to Capri and was incredibly jealous of what was basically a relationship that was taking place between Romaine and Luisa. So we know that Luisa was probably, we would use the word today, bisexual, but she was more about the person and less about the gender. She was fascinated by interesting people who she would like to try to collect. Now, to really talk about the impact of Luisa, I compared her to Lady Gaga or Madonna or all these other people. But this is a woman who would dress as a fountain to her party. She would push the envelope of what was fashion. And because of that, she has become an enormous inspiration for people today. So the image in the center is from the 2014 Louis Vuitton Marc Jacobs fashion show, again, directly inspired by Luisa. On the far right, we have John Charles RuPaul there, in a dress inspired by Luisa Cassatti. Now, she's had so many dresses. I would send you out there to do a Google to look at the things that she would wear, the costumes she would create. Many people are inspired by Luisa, and they don't even know that they were inspired by Luisa. She's a fantastic and fascinating character. Now, her grave is a very small one, and I'll come to tell you a little bit about why that is in a moment. But what is great is there is what's called a desire path. So all the grass that leads to her grave, there's not a proper path, but people have been walking that path so many times that there's basically, they've trodden their own path there. And people still go to Luisa's grave and they leave flowers or tokens or makeup or photographs or even items of clothes for the amazing Luisa. Now, before we come to talk a bit about Luisa's end, I do want to mention Luisa's daughter, because I've finally been able to find some information about her. So Luisa's daughter was called Christina. Now, Christina was also, took a bit after her mother, clearly lived in the shadow for some time. If you search her, you always come up with her mother first. But Christina had a particular relationship with another woman that is also fascinating, that of Frida Kahlo. The image on the left there is an image of Frida Kahlo and Christina Cassatti. So basically, when Frida was with Diego Rivera, her husband and famous artist, Diego famously cheated on her with a model when he was doing a mural for the Rockefeller Center. Now, in response to this, Frida was devastated and basically went off and sought the company of a number of women that she formed very intimate romantic relationships with, and one of which was Christina Cassatti. In fact, that picture on the far right, that is a portrait drawn of Christina by Frida Kahlo. So almost like the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Now, this is the headstone for Luisa Cassatti. Surprising, right? You'd imagine a woman like this deserves like a, I don't know, a cenotaph, a huge, bizarre thing, and it's this small urn. Now, the reason it is so small is because Luisa basically died in relative poverty after she spent all of her money, slowly growing to be 71 is when she passed away. She became ashamed of the limelight. She didn't want photographs of herself. She was terrified of aging. So her and her 3 Pekingese dogs lived at 32 Beaufort Gardens in South Kensington. And what would basically happen, she ended up going into a smaller and smaller flat, having to sell her clothes and sell her jewels. But people in the area tell stories of Luisa going out at night and going through bins to find bits of fabric or torn up bits of plastic that she could turn into dresses. So even at the very edge of poverty, the incredible bisexual Contessa was still making beauty out of trash, something that I think many drag queens today could celebrate. Now, tragically, when she died in poverty, she ended up with this small headstone, but the path that leads there shows that she is still this incredible figure that you can visit today and leave her something beautiful. So moving on to Charles for you.
So Charles is an interesting one. This is one that, as a result of us doing Queerly Departed the first time round, one of the followers, Lucinda Hawksley, the historian, reached out to us and told us, "Oh, did you know this about my family?" Now, Lucinda is a descendant of Charles Dickens, and so she shared the story of Charles Alston Collins, who was a great uncle or something, but essentially Dickens' son-in-law. Now, he was someone who, he was a British painter, writer and illustrator, and associated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and was born on the 25th of January, 1828. Now, he was born in Hampstead, and you're probably more familiar with his older brother, who was Wilkie Collins, the author of A Woman in White. Now, Charles, our man of focus here, was he entered into the Royal Academy and was a friend of John Everett Millais. And again, you know, he kind of rubbed with all the kind of artistic big wigs of the time and so on. And there are various paintings of his, of which are still around today. But just to kind of show you how he looked, this is an image of him on the left hand as a younger man. You can see there's a fear in his eyes, a frailty. There's something, and this is indeed something I'm gonna get to. He certainly didn't enjoy the robust health of his brother. And on the right-hand side, this is at Dickens's country residence just outside Rochester in Kent. And there is Charles with his wife, Charles Dickens' daughter, sitting down on the doorstep looking at a book. So he knew the great man himself. He would have known him intimately. But why? What's his relevance to Queerly Departed, and why is he here? Next slide, please, Sasha. So when he was a much younger man, he nearly drowned, and it was this happenstance gave him a lifelong fear of water, and indeed made him incredibly nervous. And it got to the point where even doing basic things, even such as paintings, this is a view of London. I think it's somewhere in Hackney, I believe. I might be wrong. Even painting gave him horrific pain, particularly horrific stomach pain. And William Holman Hunt, for example, actually describes him as slight with slender limbs, but erect in the head and shoulders, beautifully cut features, a large chin, a crop of orange-coloured hair, latterly a beard, blue eyes that looked at a challenger without sign of quarrelling. Now, while he was painting and doing all these kind of artworks, this is when he fell in love with Dickens' daughter, Kate. And this was after he was nursing a broken heart from Maria Rossetti, who he absolutely adored. But she rejected him, and again, coupled with his health problems, made him incredibly skittish and nervous and unsure of himself. And when he became engaged to Charles's daughter Kate in the 1860s, Dickens actually initially disapproved of the match. He wasn't sure. He kind of thought, no, well, he didn't like Wilkie Collins to begin with, the older brother, and he certainly didn't like this kind of very nervous man. He didn't see him as a man who could lead a house, really. He didn't really think that he was quite right for his daughter. But anyway, They got married. Kate was quite desperate to get out of the family home because of her father's reputation at home. And again, I'm sure we're all familiar that Dickens' own relationship with women is far from stellar. And also, it was a marriage that worked for both Kate and Charles. Kate got out of the family home, and if anything, it probably covered up the fact that Charles was likely either a bisexual or gay man. And this kind of came to a head, particularly as Kate and Charles moved to the continent to live in Paris, particularly after their wedding. And there are rumours that he was impotent, that they weren't able to consummate the marriage. Indeed, Kate writes to her father, and there is evidence to suggest that, yep, there is clearly something's not as it should be in this particular relationship. And these kind of rumours did plague him even in his own lifetime. And he also seemed to suffer as well from a weird wasting disease. Whether this was linked to the stomach pain that he had as he was a younger man, we don't know. But he eventually passes away from a disease that is likely stomach cancer in 1873 at 10 Thurlow Place in Kensington. And again, even within the Dickens family, or Lucinda Hawksley's family to this day, the rumours do persist. We never knew the true extent and measure of what he was about. And even though he only died 2 years after Dickens did, the loss obviously Kate did feel quite keenly and acutely. She obviously did have some affection for him. She would have married him otherwise. But again, you know, it's one of those things where, if we go to the next slide, please, Sasha, the loss of such a person, and we just purely don't know the true extent of his sexuality or how he would have identified, is kind of etched here. And this is from a photo on the Wealth Collection website. And this is actually Charles on his deathbed. This is him moments after death. And you can see, you know, this is probably more poetic, more poignant, more sad than any kind of photo that you probably could have had in life. And it's a beautiful rendition of him just after his final closing moments. He's buried beneath a pink granite slab in a very nondescript part of the cemetery. You'd never know, but it's just one of those histories we'd like to know more about. Who was he? What was he about? You know, why did he find himself in that particular situation? The archives don't give us the answers that we'd dearly like to know. Sasha.
So one of the interesting things about a cemetery is it's not just the story of the people that are buried there, because cemeteries are spaces and things happen in those spaces. So this is not a person, it's a whole group of people that were affected by a particular thing that was happening in Brompton Cemetery. So this is the phenomenon of the pretty policemen. Now, pretty policemen have been happening pretty much since the 1950s. They got the name pretty policeman in the 70s and 80s. Basically refers to a plainclothes policeman. They would particularly go to for a man that they considered to be attractive, and they would go to what would be believed to be a gay haunt, or a place where gay and bisexual men would meet, often a nightclub or a bathroom or a park or a cemetery. And they would go and basically go up to another man, initiate a conversation, and if the man showed any sort of romantic affection or showed any sort of interest beyond friendship, they would arrest them. So it was basically a honey trap. It was a way of basically keeping gay and bisexual men terrified, because you never knew if the man that you were flirting with was going to suddenly turn on you and put you into handcuffs, not in a good way. So the Pretty Policeman's Ball, for example, which was a sponsored London Gay Switchboard event. This took place in 1984. It was named as such, basically as a bit of a play on the concept of these policemen who were being sent out. You can see in the newspapers clamped down on park sleaze. There was an active attempt during the 80s in particular for policemen to go out and seek gay men and bisexual men to arrest them. So cruising is this uncomfortable thing that is a fact of queer life that many people don't always want to talk about. And we had a lengthy conversation with the cemetery about how we were going to talk about cruising. But the fact is, in every single city that we know of, green spaces, anything like a park and a cemetery where you can meet in public, in daylight, but then you can find somewhere quiet. These were, for many people, the only safe spaces for gay and bisexual men to meet each other during the time when this was illegal, when you could have your entire life destroyed, or you couldn't just go to a gay bar or use something like Grindr. So these were spaces that were incredibly important for queer people. Now, you're not going to be able to hear the video, I'm afraid, but I just want to show you this interesting little like snapshots. I'm just going to play it in the background whilst I'm talking. So this is an incredible video that Sheldon found, in fact, and it's a group of men. And we know the man on the far left in the sort of salmon t-shirt is he's called Brian, and he just received a camera recorder in the early to mid 90s for his birthday. So he decided to take a few of his gay friends out, and they made this video. This is in Brompton Cemetery, sitting on the bench that is still there, basically just talking about sex, talking about meeting boys, talking about lesbians, their lesbian friends who frown at them, talking about all kinds of things. You can find it on YouTube, and hopefully the cemetery will send you a link in the chat so you can have a look. But it's this lovely little snapshot of queer culture in the early 90s. And it also, the fact they chose Brompton Cemetery. Now, the reason Brompton Cemetery was chosen by these three men is because it is a known queer hotspot, and it still is to this day. Cruising still takes place across the UK. It is still a fact of queer society. Now, in terms of the Pretty Policeman, here are a few quotes that refer to Brompton Cemetery specifically. So in the 1970s, we have a man called Jonathan Black. He appears in a book called Pride, the Unlikely Story of the Hero of the Miners' Strike. You might have heard of the story of the miners' strike in the UK, and the fact that a group of gay, bisexual, trans, lesbian people came together to support working class miners in Wales. There's a whole film made on the topic. But he quotes, "I was once in Brompton Cemetery and a pretty policeman nabbed me and I was arrested. And I wasn't sent to prison, but I was taken to court, convicted and fined. And I thought, this is ridiculous. He came onto me. I didn't come onto him, but that was the way it was, a constant threat." Even in the 1980s, we have this quote from an anonymous person. This is on a criminal pardon forum. So this is an online forum where gay and bisexual men are talking about crimes that they are trying to get taken off their record, historic crimes for being gay. He says in 1981, "I revealed that in West Brompton Cemetery, circa 1981, I was charged under the 1860 Ecclesiastical Court Jurisdiction Act, having revealed my penis to the cop who had been cruising me for over an hour, and I assumed wanted to see it. Will I be pardoned?" So obviously there's this whole conversation that people were being arrested for doing this because there was no other option, because law was not in favour of queer people. There weren't many options to meet other queer men, which obviously made queer men very vulnerable to the likes of the police. And we'll come and talk a bit more about that vulnerability later. But these incidents, the Pretty Policeman policing the likes of Brompton Cemetery, led to the instigation of Gallop. So Gallop is the Gay London Police Monitoring Group. And also for a while in the 80s, there was its sister group, the Lespop, Lesbians and Policing Project. So these were basically groups of gay, bisexual, lesbian people coming together, particularly groups of lawyers and non-profit writing support groups that basically, if you got arrested by a police officer for soliciting in a park or in a cemetery, this was a way that you wouldn't lose your job, your life wouldn't end, you wouldn't end up in the newspapers. So this was a support network formed out of the likes of the Pretty Policeman. Now, I spoke about queer people being vulnerable because they need to use these kinds of spaces. You know, since the dawn of time, LGBTQ plus people have existed, and we wanted to find people like us for friendship and for romantic relationships. It's worth speaking about the Coleherne pub. So the Coleherne pub was a pub that was very, very nearby Brompton Cemetery. You can still see it today, although it's now called the Pembroke. But at the time, it was a well-known gay venue. So here's an image from the Coleherne. Now, the Coleherne has a dark link with Brompton Cemetery, and we'll be coming to it in a moment. I just want to warn you, after we get past the fun bit, the next slide is going to get heavy. We are going to be talking about extreme homophobia and murder. Right, we're going to be talking about a serial killer, so I'm just warning you about that now. But for now, I'm going to give you a quote about the joy of the Coleherne. So queer men and women and trans people would be wandering through the cemetery all the time in the 80s because they'd be on their way to one of the biggest gay venues in London, the Coleherne. Here's a wonderful quote I found online of someone talking about it. Another time I was standing at the bar going crazy, leching this big gorgeous hunk like something from Village People. He was tall, handsome with a moustache, and of course he was wearing a hard hat helmet. The barman came over, and in the campus, the most effeminate voice possible, this hunk of a man said, "A double gin and tonic, please, darling." So it was a space where you can imagine all the conversations that we have in gay bars, the silly kind of double entendres, meeting friends, going out for a dance, possibly a bit of flirtation, in this case, a little bit of femme shaming, but all the same, this was a epicenter for the queer community who would be coming to and from the station through the cemetery. And because of drinking, because, not wanting to be seen by the police at this time, this made people very, very vulnerable. Now, the Coleherne has a dark side to its story, in that it is associated with not one, not two, but 3 different serial killers who specifically preyed on gay men. Now, one of the most famous of these is the man that's pictured here on the right. Obviously, at this stage, they did not have a name, but the man who was later arrested was known as Colin Ireland. Now, Colin Ireland, I'm not going to tell you much about him because, to be honest, I don't want to linger on the killer. I want to speak about the victims and their lives. But he was known in the papers as the Gay Slayer, and the newspapers of the 80s reveled in it. The details, the sordid details that they tried to share about the victims to basically imply that it was their fault. Now, the Coleherne was a favourite haunt for Colin Ireland. In fact, around 3 of his victims, possibly 4, came from the Coleherne pub. Now, these are the victims here. So we have Peter, this is going from left to right, Peter, Andrew, Christopher, Emmanuel, and Percy. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them just very briefly. So Pete Walker was a choreographer, he was a dancer. Christopher, he was a librarian. And Perry Bradley Hill was a businessman. We don't know exactly what kind of business, there's not much detail. Andrew Collier was a housing warden. And Emmanuel Spitton was a chef, he was a cook. These 5 men were all murdered by Colin Ireland. And at least 2 of them, so Percy and Emmanuel, walked with Colin through Brompton Cemetery the last night that they were alive. So it's a dark thing, and I just want to remember that because we are queer, because we have for much of our history tried to avoid the police, tried to avoid the limelight, it has made us incredibly vulnerable to predation. And when these men were written about in the 80s, when people were writing about them, the details that went into their sex lives, that some of them were into BDSM or leather or any of these things, the relevant details to try to take away their humanity was absolutely shocking, and in many ways entirely unforgivable. The other 2 murderers who preyed on young men who went to the Coleherne were Dennis Nielsen and Michael Lupo. Dennis Nielsen killed 12 young men and boys. Now, it's still the case that LGBTQ plus people, particularly young people, are vulnerable today, but particularly in the 80s, this was a huge epidemic of an issue. So moving on to something more lighthearted for you, Sheldon.
Indeed. Now, this is my favourite person probably buried in the entire cemetery, queer or not. I just think he's an absolutely fascinating man. And we know for sure he was a homosexual man, and it's important to know the reasons why. Because he came from a world of power, wealth, and class. So therefore, he could afford to go around, as camp as anything, and to not worry about the repercussions of, perhaps telling people to buzz off in a very effeminate voice. This is a liberty that many people of the working class did not have. So it's interesting to see his story. Is obviously it's of a certain strata of society, but it's interesting nonetheless, because this is someone who can definitively say, yes, this was a gay man or a bisexual man from our understanding of it. And again, he came from power. His grandfather was twice the Lord Chancellor. Various family members were diplomats, politicians, and explorers. He broke the mold by becoming one of the greatest actors of the 20th century, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. Appeared in over 60 films, but his best-known role was in the production of, I've already mentioned when I was talking about Robert Keeley, and that's in The Bride of Frankenstein, which was James Whale's sequel to the original film that came out a few years before that and was released in 1935. Now, Thesiger was born on the 15th of January 1879 in Chelsea, and despite his family background, arts were his calling. Never mind empire, never mind soldiering, never mind all that. No, 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 no. He was going to be an artist. And so he went off to study at the Marlborough College and the Slade School of Art with aspirations of becoming a painter. And he preferred drama, really, and you know, as kind of things wore on, obviously the theatrical nature in him did kind of tend to dominate. But as the you know, just as he was kind of beginning to kind of try out his acting muster, the First World War broke out, and he was often asked, you know, what was his recollections of the war, you know, particularly after the Second World War. He would often kind of recollect and go, "Oh my dear, the noise, the people." And never mind the fact that there was kind of bombs flying around and everything. He just couldn't stand the fact that the people around him were frankly abhorrent. That was the big thing he couldn't stand about it. But anyway, he in 1917, just after the war ended, he ends up marrying the former the friend of his college friend William Rankin. And we don't know why he did this. There was no kind of indication there was any kind of romantic relationship going on. But both his friend's sister and he adored his friend William. And it suggested that perhaps he married this woman because they wanted to remain close to William as a weird kind of threesome kind of, you know, triumvirate kind of relationship. We don't know. But whatever the reason was, William was so shocked by this. His friend William was so distraught by this, he actually shaved his head in protest, as you do, to this particular union of the time. Now, obviously, by this point as well, he's beginning to develop his acting career. He has his first performance in a play called A Little Bit of Fluff, which, I mean, you can't make this up, can you? Really, what a great thing to kind of first act in. And then he also ends in his first kind of film debut is in a film spoof called The Real Thing at Last, which is a spoof of Macbeth, where he plays one of the witches in drag. Now, sadly, there's no kind of film version of us to kind of see in this, but he does kind of dabble with drag. And if you go on Google, you'll see various other performances he does throughout his career. He does kind of delve into the world again, much like the Keeleys back in the 1850s and 1860s. He does kind of play around with gender identity when it comes to his kind of filmic roles. Now, in 1925, he definitely appeared in drag again. He appeared in Noel Coward's On With the Dance. And of course, Noel Coward has particular precedence here because he's Sacha Coward's his relative. So nice little queer link there. Hello, Noel. Hello, Sacha. Blood, blood, blood. But also around about this time as well, he has a very strong friendship with the director James Whale, who was a very well-known gay director at the time. And obviously, he cast Thesiger in the role of Dr. Septimus Pretorius in the sequel to his original Frankenstein film, where he plays Septimus Pretorius, who is essentially the mentor of Dr. Frankenstein. If you go to the next slide, Sacha, I think it's the right one. Doesn't matter, it's not. But so this is the poster for it. This is a contemporary poster of the time, and obviously you've got the Bride of Frankenstein with her white kind of lightning bolt hairstyle there, and it was a huge film. Huge film. And again, going off what I said before about the potency of Frankenstein and its importance to the queer community as an outcast, as someone who's not liked or is not seen as being normal. He's seen abnormal and it can never fully be part of society according to everyone else. Its provenance has had academic papers written about it, and I spent a good part of my afternoon this afternoon kind of looking into that history, and indeed Thesiger's role within that history as well, giving kind of precedence to it as well. But for what we know, he played the role as Septimus Pretorius as a camp old queen, and he loved it. And you can go on YouTube and you can see him perform, and it's a camp masterclass, really. He flares his nostrils whenever there's a woman on sharing screen time with him. The character just kind of almost recoils. How dare this person kind of interfere with my protege Frankenstein? It's not really on. And it's fascinating to see, even in the 1920s, to see this being committed to celluloid. So. Another thing as well, just going on to the next slide, Sacha, it might be the video. I'm not sure if it. Skip it. It's fine. We don't need to see it. You can use YouTube for that. Another thing he did was needlework. He absolutely adored needlework. Now, this is, again, someone who clearly didn't give a flying fancy about what people thought of him, and particularly after the Second World War, he took needlework to a new level because he was actually using it as a tuition tool for soldiers who'd experienced, you know, damage in the trenches from fighting. And so he actually advocated the use of needlework to help, like, steady hands and stuff, and it was quite kind of revolutionary in that sense. But he took to needlepoint as a pastime, and he became absolutely fabulous for it. And indeed, you can go on YouTube and there are videos of him doing needlework. He is absolutely astounding at it. And, you know, there's an old recollection, I think it was said by Alec Guinness. He was in this pub in Chelsea, particularly rough pub, to be fair, loads of local types and gangsters and thugs around him. And, you know, they're there with their pints, you know, effing the jeffing and, you know, being all manly and what have you. And there he is in the middle of the pub, just doing needlework. He doesn't care. He doesn't care that there's people like that around him. And of course they go, "What you doing, mate? What you doing, mate?" And he's going, "I'm the stitching bitch of Chelsea. Buzz off." He just tells them to get out of it. He doesn't care. But again, his social status actually gave him protection, really. I'd be interested to see if a working class man who's doing, you know, needlepoint in a pub in Chelsea, if they would have been afforded the same kind of reception or, you know, get out of jail free card that he did because he was him. And there's other kind of stories that are connected to him as well, like, you know, walking to a party, openly announcing, "Anyone for a spot of buggery?" Didn't care, probably, you know, was just looking for action or whatever. And again, used his prestige to get it. And he was, you know, again, he continued acting well into old age. He died in his sleep in 1961, a few months before the release of his final film, The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone. And he was buried in the Thesiger family plot, which is the next slide, Sasha, just off the main stretch of Brompton Cemetery. And it's the final resting place of many other Thesigers. The Thesiger family are a fascinating bunch to look into. And he's buried there, you know, again, with his parents and indeed with his extended family. So fascinating chap. Do kind of do some more research into him. Sasha.
Richard Hen Collins.
No, next one. Keep on. Oh, okay. I'll briefly mention Hen Collins. Another one, again, I'll just briefly touch on it because we're kind of approaching close to time now. He was the first judge who presided over Oscar Wilde's first court case. Now, again, Oscar Wilde, he deserves a talk all of his own, and I'm not going to spend any time doing it about it. But when this was brought to court in the 1890s, for example, it blew the doors off what was to be in the upper echelons of society. Something homosexuality and or same-sex affairs were known about. They were never discussed, but you know the fact that Oscar wanted to prosecute the Marquis of Queensberry here, the father of his great love, Lord Bosey, the fact that he wanted to prosecute him after he was presented a card while he was out dining, you know, to Oscar Wilde posing as a sodomite, really did put a lot of people in society who may have, you know, who were either what we would understand to be gay or bisexual, really did make them quite nervous because they were like, "Oscar, what are you doing? Can we not do this, please?" So resolute and to a certain extent arrogant was Oscar that he thought that he could probably get away with it. And Richard Hen Collins, who's just next slide, I think, Sasha, if you show his tomb, he's off the oh, it's not there, doesn't matter. He's off the main stretch, but again, he's not someone. Richard Hen Collins himself is not someone who was queer. He certainly wasn't. You can call him an ally, but in terms of someone who was, he was there essentially at this incredibly important crossroads of British legal history, when it was, you know, a very well-known, publicised. It certainly wasn't the first case of homosexuality to reach the courts, but it certainly was the most kind of prominent in the 19th century. So again, Richard Hen Collins briefly touched on him and his historical importance to legal history.
So the grave we're looking at now is, so this isn't the grave for Julian Phelps, Alan. This is the grave designed by Julian Phelps Allen. So again, there's many ways that you can end up becoming on a queer history tour. Now, Julian is an interesting character, and I've always sort of struggled to find ways to talk about her, and I've actually changed the way that I've spoken about her. So when we first did this tour, I actually used they, them pronouns. Now, having done a little bit of digging, it's very clear that Julian preferred to be referred to using she, her pronouns, would always refer to herself as Miss Julian Phelps Allen. And so all letters and mail were always addressed to Miss Julian Phelps Allen. Now, she was an artist and a sculptor. Also, fascinatingly, she was active both for the First and the Second World War with the Auxiliary Territorial Service. So she was as someone who was definitely assigned female at birth, she was someone who was bucking the trend of what it was to be a woman. And this is where we come into a bit of a grey zone. So we can see the work of Julian. And just to say, the image on the left there, that kind of portrait, some people think this is kind of a self-portrait because there are very few photos. Oh, there's nothing that I could find of Julian. Julian was quite a secretive person. Now, Julian was not born named Julian. Julian had a different name, what would be termed a traditional woman's name, but quickly changed her name to Julian when she started to go to the Royal Academy, where she studied sculpture and fine art. Now, it's during this time that she made a name for herself as an artist, where we have this complexity of a character. Now, some people have interpreted the fact that she changed her name to Julian as simply being because she wanted to be a successful artist. And obviously, there are many cases of, you know, the likes of George Eliot, people changing their names partially because they want to be respected, and to be a woman would not to be respected. But Julian wanted to be referred to as Julian by all her friends and all her family and everyone. It wasn't just a pseudonym. This was something that she called herself as well. And some people have argued that this is, so for example, the Tate have argued this is significant of a lesbian identity, particularly of this sort of interwar and post-Second World War period. This was a way that some people would show sapphic or lesbian tendencies, was by adopting a sort of masculine or tomboy name. Some people have argued that Julian was non-binary despite using she, her pronouns. It's a really difficult one. And to be honest, if you come down any one side, you are going to upset a group of people because everybody wants ownership of queer history. Understandably, there's such a dearth of it. All I can say is Julian was almost certainly queer. I cannot tell you exactly how. And Julian was very specific about how she wanted to be identified. So using she, her pronouns, her artwork was referred to the artist as they, them pronouns. And she herself took on a name that was traditionally that of a man. So I will let you decide the exact meaning of that. But it's interesting as well that she produced the headstone for Emmeline Pankhurst. So to jump back a second, this is the headstone for the suffragette, or the leader of the suffragette movement, known as Emmeline Pankhurst. So again, this is a person who was definitely invested in feminism as well, which does not necessarily make her queer, but all the other things and readings into her identity, it means that she is a difficult person, but a fascinating person to unpack. I'm going to very briefly touch on the suffragettes as well, because we're looking at the headstone to Emmeline Pankhurst, and she is probably the most famous headstone in the whole of Brompton Cemetery, the most visited. There is a conversation about the suffragettes. Now, it's very unlikely Emmeline herself was LGBTQ+. There's no evidence of this whatsoever. But her daughter, Christabel, there is some evidence for. So on the far right, if you look at those images of women, on the far right is a woman called Mary Blaithwaite. Now, Mary Blaithwaite is one of those wonderful people who wrote diaries, and because of that, we have an insight into her mind. Now, we know that Mary Blaithwaite would probably have identified as either a lesbian or bisexual. She had very romantic affections, very beautiful esoteric writing she would write about other women in the suffragette movement. But in terms of the pictures there, in the middle, we have Christabel Pankhurst, and then on the left, we have another woman, and this is, bear with me one second. I forgot. Oh, there we go. It is Annie Kearney. Sorry, Annie Kearney. So Annie Kearney and Christabel Pankhurst were observed by Mary Blaithwaite as having a relationship. The reason being that Mary was very jealous of Annie. She was a bit in love with Annie. So we see in her diary, Annie slept with someone else again last night. There was someone else in Annie's bed this morning. She would track who Annie was sleeping with. And one of these people was Christabel. So we know that within the suffragette movement, there was queerness. Now, the issue is that top right image there, the horrible picture drawn to kind of mock women, mock suffragettes for going for the vote, is often lesbianism was something that was used as an insult. The implication was the reason you become a suffragette is you were such a hideous, ugly, weird, non-woman that you would only be able to sleep with other women, that no man would have you. And this means that real queerness, the real bisexual, lesbian and queer suffragettes often get masked behind this horrible propaganda where lesbianism is used as a tool to attack women. Just because that's the case doesn't mean there weren't queer people, and there were queer connections through her daughter with Emmeline Pankhurst herself. So we come to the end of the tour. Sorry that we overran a little bit, and sorry for the slammings and bangings in the background. There's a whole group of people moving into the flat that I'm basically coming to you from, which is a bit tricky. So we've got a whole number of things. On February the 24th, we have Rainbow River, which is me and Sheldon with the Brunel Museum. Again, this is a virtual tour. Sheldon, what are you doing with Claire on the 28th?
On the 28th, I'm going around the Parisian and French cemeteries to look at lesbian, bisexual and transgender history in graveyard galpals, because LGBT History Month does tend to rely a little bit too much on the G for my liking. So just highlighting some other kind of like lesbian, bisexual and transgender female stories to kind of balance that out. And then on the 5th of March, I'm doing a Highgate online cemetery tour, another cemetery tour, love it, and it's Highgate, beautiful. And then International Women's Day, I'm doing Wonder Women of Hampstead Cemetery, online talk. And then on July, Sasha?
We are working with the National Trust, with Hatchlands Park House, and we're running an event called House Proud, which is exploring some of the really cool LGBT history associated with an old traditional English property. So we really hope you enjoyed our tour today. We hope you got a kick out of it. Thank you ever so much for giving your evening, or if you're on the other side of the world, your morning, wherever you are, to LGBT history. If there are any questions and people still have time, we would be very, very happy to take those.
There is one, Sasha, that's been posted in the chat from Russell, which is, has Parliament in recent years acted to expunge convictions of queer people preyed upon by police in earlier years?
Yeah, so it's a really challenging one. They have, but for a long time, you had to actually write to Parliament for this to happen. So that meant that it required, firstly, the person had to be alive. Right, many gay men, for many reasons, let's not just mention the HIV crisis, are no longer with us, and many of those things happened a long time ago. And you also have to have, you know, the desire to write a letter about what may have been the most humiliating moment in your life and ask for a pardon. It's a whole thing there. So many people were pardoned, and there has been a whole fleet of automatic pardons based on some things. But in the case where people were arrested having sex in public, officially that is still seen as a crime. And so unless you write in about it, it's not pardoned, which is a real shame.
Yeah, it's just really shocking, isn't it? I've learnt loads, and there's been loads of love for you guys in the chat. Lots of people saying how much they've learned. So thank you very much. And most, that was really the only question we had. So if you've got time, it might be worth scrolling up so you can see all the lovely comments people are leaving for you. Thank you everyone who has joined us this evening, and thanks for sticking with it as well. It was so interesting. So thank you very much. Oh, one more from Yikting. How come gay men seem to have been more persecuted against in history compared to lesbian women?
So that again is a really complex question to answer. It's very difficult to compare trauma and pain, but traditionally, and this is a very basic argument because this is a whole essay, right? But traditionally, the whole act of sex has only been deemed to be sex if a penis is involved. right? That's a historical thing. That is your misogyny. That is kind of why there's sexism, that it's only sex if a penis is involved. Therefore, two women for a long time could do all kinds of things, and that would not be seen as sex. It was basically invisible. It was erased. It was kind of pushed to one side. So therefore, two men were seen as, for a long period of time, absolutely disgusting and depraved. That is not to say that lesbians and bisexual women haven't suffered hugely from erasure. So even though we have been in some ways more violently persecuted, in some ways, that's not to say lesbians haven't, by the way, but just because of that, at least we've also had a platform to speak. And if you go to any LGBT History Month, they're delivered by people like me and Sheldon, two gay men, whereas lesbian voices, trans women, bi women, their voices are much less heard. So it's a different kind of punishment. Does that make sense? So that it's just awful for everyone. Let's put it that way. We can't measure the pain. It's just different.
Thank you. And the reason I started to smile at the start of your answer was not due to the horrificness of this, but because someone had also put that they loved your T-shirt.
Yes.
It really threw me. I was like, oh yeah, it's great.
Bustly Merman represent, cannot not wear that for LGBT History Month. Well, in that case, I just want to say thank you, and thank you for having us, Brompton Cemetery, Royal Parks. As ever, it's a real pleasure. And also a big thank you to Sheldon, my lovely partner and compatriot in queer crime. Thank you for doing queer history with me.
Well, thank you, Sasha, as well.
Thank you both so much. You've been absolutely wonderful. And I'm sure, like, you can, like, do you want to plug your Instagram? So the Cemetery Club isn't the Sheldon, and like.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. It's at Sasha Downspace Coward. I do post a hell of a lot of nonsense, just a warning.
But if you have any further questions for either Sasha or Sheldon, I'm sure they'd be happy to
find Cemetery Club and you can get in contact with all of us.
Cemetery Club on all the socials. I'm easy enough to find.
Perfect.